Hello, everybody. It's Monday, February 24th, and we've got some Chapo for you. On today, Felix and I will be turning our attention to the world of war once again, armed conflict, as it proceeds apace in this human comedy. And joining us to discuss this, we couldn't think of two better guests. From Radio War Nerd, it's Mark Ames and John Dolan. Mark, John, welcome back to the program. Always a joy to have you.
Thanks.
Oh, thanks.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. It's our honor.
Well, okay, like to kick things off, obviously, like probably the biggest news in the world of war is the fact that the war in Ukraine is now entering its fourth year, but with, as you mentioned, sort of a surprise twist. Basically, that Ukraine's biggest patron now seems to be switching sides. So, to begin, let me just ask, like, what are the current prospects for an end to this war in Ukraine? And what does the end of that war look like for the principal actors, Ukraine, Russia, the EU, and the United States?
God. I think we could say this, that every year after the first 6 months, every month and every year has been exponentially worse than the previous year for Ukraine and for the Ukraine cause. Now, it's the Ukraine war. It's one of those, theory of relativity things. The Ukraine war looks different to Washington and to whatever's left of Joe Biden's mind and things like that than it does to Ukrainians who are suffering from this war and fighting this war. So from, Biden's point of view, if you remember that harrowing Time magazine interview, maybe the only one he did in like the last 2 years of his presidency that was published last year, Time was asking him, the war is going pretty badly, and what are you going to do? And is this going to be a problem? And he snapped at them. What do you mean it's going badly, man? He's like, Russia's been degraded. They've lost 300,000 killed, man. And he was just, all of a sudden he came alive, and this number of all the dead that have been killed. So to him and to DC, the war was looking, I guess, in some ways almost better and better because more Russians were dying. But in terms of how it ends, it ends badly for Ukraine, absolutely badly for Ukraine, broken apart. However this war ends, this is not going to end the way that all the cheerleaders were saying, with the orcs defeated, Russia broken up into 100 states. And they were really saying this. And, is Ukraine going to take Crimea and like Rostov and Voronezh and parts of Western Russia?
There was a lot of pundit anxiety about should Ukraine stop short of the Crimea, and I think that got settled pretty quickly.
Yeah. So, Ukraine has been used. I mean, it's used by Russia to send a message to the U.S., NATO, and used by the West to kill Russians. And it's paying the price, except for really the people on our payroll who just got cut off by Trump. But they've made out pretty well. So they're screwed. Europe, well, okay, let's start with Russia. How does Russia end? How does this war end for Russia? Put it this way, it looked really bad for Russia in 2022. By September of 2022, I mean, the initial invasion went poorly. The initial plan to try to send a message to the West through Ukraine that Russia meant business and to listen to Russia and to, not advance NATO into Ukraine and keep advancing West. That was all failing badly. And they should have done a deal early on. The West should have, because Russia was not in a great position in the early months of the war when Boris Jordan flew out and killed that deal that Ukraine was about to sign, and then maybe in September, October of 2022. And since then, Putin has snatched, defeat from victory from the jaws of defeat, because it looked so bad. It looked so dire for Russia by September, October of 2022. Russia was under sanction and had lost enormous amounts of manpower and armaments and seemed to be getting isolated, and things were looking really badly. No one could imagine that they could turn it around, and they have. And even Biden's top military people were saying last year that Russia's military now is bigger and stronger than it was when the invasion started. So the whole purpose of Biden's purpose, I don't know how well that's worked out. And Russia has reoriented its economy to China. So Russia's going to achieve, it seems like, at least some of its strategic goals. Like Ukraine is not going to be in NATO. And that is a huge, huge strategic victory for Russia. Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, and rump Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, because that would require the Europeans and the US to go to war for Ukraine. And Hegseth, I mean, we were coy about that until Trump came to power, and Trump just made it explicit. We're not going to war for Ukraine. And then the Europeans, after Hegseth's speech, said, we need to be Europeans and we'll stand up, and not since 1939, da, da, da. And then they all had to put it on the line. Would you send peacekeepers? And the Poles, who have been the loudest, most militant for this war, came out publicly. The prime minister said, no, we're not sending peacekeepers. And Macron, who was the other one calling for more direct action, came out and said, France will not send peacekeepers. So, Ukraine has Keir Starmer, but that's about it right now.
You touched on it a little bit, but it is, I mean, like the main story really with a lot of this is sort of like how resilient Russia was to the sanctions, and not just resilient, how it really like fucked the West more than anyone in the end. But one thing I thought was pretty interesting, you did touch on it, is just given how horribly it started out for them, this turned out to be something they probably never really dreamed of at the start, which is they got to sort of test and refine their military against like not all of the best Western technology, but a lot of it. Yeah. And they got to develop like a proof of concept on how they would use their Air Force against like Western air defenses. Like that shit they were doing where they would just have like MiG-31s fly way higher than anyone else and just fucking rip through everyone with those Kinzhals. I'm probably fucking up the pronunciation, but the air launched, air launched ballistic missile. Mm-hmm. They probably didn't really anticipate that in February.
Well, I mean, all of these weapons, and America does produce some very good weapons, but they've never gone against anything like near peer, let alone Russia level. And the idea in the first 6 months of the war that was very popular, pushed out of Ukraine, but also very popular with Europeans and in Washington and London, is that the Russians, like, because they conducted the war so incompetently early on, there was something genetic there, and they would never adjust. And actually, you would have to have never read a single history book in your life to think that A, Russians start off wars well, and B, that they don't learn and adapt and wind up.
They're closers. They're fourth quarter players.
Yeah. I mean, like, if I could compare them to anyone, it would be like Jake LaMotta in a few fights.
Well, I actually saw this fight with a Russian against some incredibly sculpted-looking workout king from the U.S., and the workout king was just jumping up and down before the fight, and he just couldn't be contained. He just was dying to get across the ring. And this Russian looked like he'd just gotten out of bed, and he was flabby and tired. And he sort of waved to the crowd like, I got a hangover, leave me alone. And this American sculpted guy ran across the ring and just knocked him down with the left hook. And he slowly got up, and he had all these prison tattoos all over him. Okay, you want to be like that?
I think I know the exact fight you're talking about.
Yeah,
that's Alexander Emelianenko versus James Thompson.
Right, brother of the Emelianenko who was big. Yeah.
Fedor's brother. Fedor, among like people think consensus probably best heavyweight of all time. Alex had like the really scary prison tattoos. Fedor and Alex had a falling out because Alex had a pretty nasty criminal conviction in Russia. But Alex, I don't know if this will shock you, his fighting career had to go on hold because he had hepatitis C. in 2015.
Yeah. Well, you haven't finished up what happens. I mean, I'm assuming he then
he just demolishes
turns him into
and,
an accordion.
Not a one punch thing, just like 1 minute, very damaging series of blows of all kinds, and guy is down.
Yeah. Not so pretty no more. But to Felix's point, like, so when they first introduced, for example, the HIMARS, in that first month, and I think this is back in 2022, it's a very good weapon system. And at first, it was causing enormous damage. It helped Ukraine a lot, sort of prepare the ground for what wound up being their big breakout a couple months later in August, September of 2022. But within 2 months maximum, the Russians had figured it out. And it just has not been it hasn't been a wonder weapon, certainly, since then. And this is the case with every single new weapon system. And so that is also a problem for America and the West, because now these weapon systems, I mean, NATO and the US are all about wars that are won in weeks. They don't have there's no plan for like a 3-year war, based on production. And so a lot of these weapon systems now have been tested by the Russians, and they can share that now with the Chinese, with the North Koreans, of course, with whoever else who is interested, and I do think that's a problem. Ukraine's military is large. It's much larger than any of the other continental Europeans. So this is a very formidable military, or was. A lot of their best soldiers, best units have been killed or, turned into amputees. And they are actually not nearly as good a fighting force as they used to be. And they're beset by horrific levels of corruption and abuse and poor morale and exploitation.
Yeah. Well, you have to go back to NATO. And what I particularly think of is years of NATO commissioning painters to do sales paintings for its new weapons system. And they would always show a kind of clean war in which Russian armor columns became the patsy, the bad guys who were easy to wipe out in a Western. And Russia played to that stereotype early on. They tried armored penetrations of Ukrainian lines, and they didn't have the infantry to support it at that time. And they got picked off in what was at least a humiliating way. It may not have been significant in a strategic sense, but it was deeply humiliating. And they fell back and decided, well, we got all these artillery shells, and we got mines, we got artillery shells, we got more of them than they do, and we're just going to grind them up.
And do you think it was, John, that like a sort of a shift in tactics away from like an active war about, like a blitzkrieg to like seize territory, make it to Kiev, and then like as soon as the war became about a grinding war of attrition, that's where the Russians began to find success? Like what accounts for this shift in initially disastrous invasion of Ukraine, and now one in which they seem to be having the upper hand now?
Well, there are a lot of wars, as Mark said, in which, Russia didn't do well in the early going. And actually, there's a history of wars like that in the U.S., too. If you think about the course of the Civil War,
the Union got rinsed for like the first 2.5 years of the Civil War.
And this is often the case with a highly motivated, smaller opponent. But what happened is that even under McClellan, who was possibly the worst commander Union armies have ever
John,
had.
he never did anything. He was great at like logistics, but he just simply wouldn't attack the enemy. He just stayed put. Yeah, and then he got like scarlet fever or something.
I know. Well, he got yellow fever, I think. But he finally wrote a tearful letter when he was backed up against the Potomac, protected by like 12 gunboats and 120,000 troops, saying to Lincoln, These are perhaps my last moments. You better not free the slaves or you'll upset somebody's sign, the former George McClellan, soon to be dead. But anyway, even while he was being a coward, Lee in the 7 Days Battle had to send a lot of troops against him because Lee knew that he was a coward, and he would. But those soldiers were probably the best soldiers in the Confederacy. They had swarmed to the Richmond and South Carolina areas from all over the South, and they kept dying. And I don't think it's fully understood how much of an impact that had. I mean, it didn't matter that their commander was a coward and a fool. The Union people had a coward and a fool for a leader. I mean, Lee was a good commander, as good as anybody could get, but he still had to send troops up against increasingly entrenched enemies. And the South had a smaller white population. They absolutely refused to recruit African Americans, and sooner or later, it was going to tell on them. So, these wars have a certain course. The bigger country, the more mobilized country tends to grind it out.
Yeah, and I would say, one of the major turning points of the war that was not appreciated at the time properly and not predicted. In fact, I remember Michael Kaufman, one of the big pundits, kind of, NATO pro-Ukraine pundits, said there was no way this would happen right up to the day it happened, was Putin's announcement in September 2022 of what they call partial mobilization. That changed everything since then. Russia went in there with a very small force for an invasion force of a large country like Ukraine, and things didn't work out well. And as soon as they realized, well, okay, this needs to turn into the kind of war that Russia has tended to do well in, which is an attritional, broad front war where production and manpower are going to win. So that meant he didn't want to do it. They still call it the special military operation. You go to jail in Russia if you call it a war or an invasion. But they did a partial mobilization, which was very successful. And they've also offered tons of money because the sanctions have not worked, which is a real shock. This is another technology we need to talk about that it was tested and beaten. Sanctions, which is economic war, work really well against weaker, kind of one or two resource-based, divided or sort of not very strong states and smaller ones. The sanctions have not worked. When they were first announced, Biden bragged it was going to turn the ruble to rubble. And it didn't.
He's got a silver tongue.
I know.
How did he lose?
Exactly. And what happened instead is that because Biden, and I know he did this without a PhD, you'll never believe this, but he managed to alienate both China and Russia at the same time and make it in China's interest by shooting down balloons and sending his people to Taiwan, make it in their existential interest to back Russia as much as they possibly could. Otherwise, it was clear China was next. So that was a brilliant move. You definitely want to put all the enemies together with, in your big war plan. But that's a big technology that was tested and it failed. And so we didn't have the levers we thought. But as you said, the blowback is from the sanctions really blew back on European countries. We just saw the AfD, this Nazi adjacent party, just doubled their score from 2022 before the war started. And I think they polled AfD voters and they all said because cost of living increases.
Yeah. Mark, do you remember, speaking of incredible Biden turns of phrases that if we had a fair media, there'd be no more Democratic Party. It would be the Brandon Party,
right?
And everyone would be in it.
Yeah.
Putin's price hike, the greatest piece of political messaging I have ever heard.
Yes, Putin's price hike. They pushed that hard, and people they didn't know what they were talking about because They were also talking up this war like it was the greatest moral crusade since World War II. America was back, George Packer in the Atlantic, like this war.
Oh God.
We're the good guys. And Ukraine embodies all of the great values. It was like we were finally going to wash away the sins of the last 20 years and the global wars and terror and all the shit we've done all over the world through this just beautiful, great war in Ukraine.
And it would be one that would like no Americans would die in as well.
Yeah.
So it's
Yes,
just sort of
that
like
was
finally we get to be the good guys without sacrificing anything or risking anything really on our own behalf. But like we're fighting Russia, our old adversary. But like Mark, on a recent episode, you said that like a lot of the war in Ukraine has to be kind of understood in like in the context of the domestic politics of the United States of America,
absolutely.
and like this sense of nostalgia, this sense of revenge. I mean, like I can hear people already getting angry because like Ukraine's its own country. It's not America is not. We're only just bystanders in this. But like, could you talk a little bit more about what you mean about how like the Ukraine war is like it has to be understood through this filter of like how the United States sees itself?
Yeah, but and first of all, I should just say, like, Ukraine has the right to defend itself. It was invaded, and they have the right to defend itself. And I've always had that position. I don't know about you guys. I mean, I know because we talk about the war. There were times when I was accused of being a NATO shill, and many times I've been accused of being a Putin shill, and whatever. It's just a lot of the discourse around it has been really stupid. So leaving that aside, but we cannot pretend that the reality is for America, Ukraine and its war is a proxy war. And it works on many levels. So it's primarily a proxy war to weaken a major rival, Russia, which became a headache for, a regional problem for the U.S. empire. And they wanted to kneecap it, hobble it down. It was very clear when Biden came back into power, he and Blinken worked with their counterparts and Sullivan, their counterparts in Zelensky's administration to reverse what Zelensky was voted in to do, which was end the low-level hostility that was going on in the Donbass and come to a final peace deal. That's why people voted him in with 75% of the vote. Zelensky flipped when Biden came to power, he said, here's what we want you to do, and we're going to back you all the way. Heat things up with the Russians. And we're going to get you a better deal, and we're going to show the Russians they can't boss us around. So, but, Ukraine also was directly involved in the sort of the MAGA versus the center split within this country, in the kind of elite factional split in this country.
You also mentioned how it was a severe miscalculation by Zelensky to essentially not hedge his bets on this upcoming the presidential election that just happened. Because with Trump, now we get this attitude from Trump and his State Department that Ukraine should really show some gratitude to us. And by the way, we'll also have all of their oil and rare earth minerals. First of all, does Ukraine even have any rare earth minerals? I keep hearing about they're going to give us their minerals, and I'm just wondering, like, what
Trump is like an old world monkey.
It really is. I mean, who knows if there really is, or how. I mean, this whole rare earth thing, it's just rocks. It's more rocks, like, do they have oil? They have some lithium, but the Russians are about to take it. Lithium seems to matter. They have coking coal, which matters for their metallurgical industry, which is big in Ukraine, but a lot of it is in Russian hands now. And the coking coal, which is used to process all the metal industry in the rest of Ukraine, that has now fallen into Russian hands, 90% of it. So, I don't know, but it's pretty clear that what Trump is doing is punishing Ukraine, punishing the Europeans, but really punishing Ukraine. It's kind of in a similar way that Putin punished Ukraine to get at the West. Trump's punishing Ukraine because he's personally pissed. I mean, if you go back and look at, first in 2016, we talked about this in the last show, in the 2016 election, Ukraine is where the Democrats got Russiagate going. Right? Ukraine is where the whole Paul Manafort scandal happened. It was
the perfect phone call.
Yeah, and Serhiy Lishchenko came up with the black box, the ledgers. The phone call is 2019. But even in 2016, Manafort, if you remember, Trump's campaign manager in 2016 had to resign because a Democrat Party aligned and USAID funded Ukrainian deputy claimed to have proof of these ledgers showing bribe money paid by Yanukovych to Paul Manafort. And that's why. So Trump's campaign was supposed to be over in August because his campaign manager had to resign because of ties to Yanukovych and Russia. And so that's where the problems first start. And then 2019, they tried to get him on Russiagate, right? The Mueller report comes out in 2019. They can't impeach him over it because there's no collusion, even according to the Mueller report. So then they go to basically Ukraine Gate, which is the phone call where Trump calls up Zelensky, this new president, Jewish comedian in an anti-Semitic country, calls him up and says, I want help from you to dig up some dirt on Hunter Biden, former Vice President Biden's son, because we know he was up to dirty stuff there. Hunter Biden, after the Maidan Revolution in 2014, Hunter Biden was hired by Burisma, this huge gas company, to basically lobby his dad. And because of criminal charges and potential sanctions that hung over this company. So Hunter Biden is brought into the board and paid $83,000 a month in a country where the average wage at the time was between $200 and $300 a month. And it just so happens that Biden leans on the president to fire the prosecutor general, who is corrupt. But the thing that is the problem is he's pursuing a case against Burisma, which is where Hunter Biden is getting his money from. And Daddy Biden, when he's vice president, succeeds in getting the prosecutor general thrown out of office. And that is a scandal and should be a scandal. So Trump calls up Zelensky after he becomes president and says, you've got something I want, I got something you want, which is like $200 million in aid. Let's do a deal. And this call is listened into by this guy, Alexander Vindman, who's on the National Security Council, who is Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian. And he's scandalized by that because it is,
He was already a hero with the Biden people, right? In the sense that true blue officers were heroes in the McCarthy era with Democrats of the time. And they had him already there as someone who could be trusted. But there is something about this I don't understand, and I probably should, but Zelensky had so much time to hedge his bets, and he never seemed to do that. Couldn't he have just said, I think they're both fine, upstanding people?
I kind of tried to, but I don't think I don't think the the centrist establishment in America allowed him. There was no being good to both sides. One side was evil, Nazi, Putinist, right? And the other side is democracy, freedom.
Right.
And so you're a traitor if you, and he did sort of try to hedge his bets. He tried to keep a neutralist position as much as he could in 2019. I'm saying in 2019.
John, when you say you're sort of ventriloquizing of what Zelensky should have said, brought to mind a novel I know you're a big fan of, Charles Portis's True Grit, where Maddie refers to Woodrow Wilson as the finest Presbyterian gentleman of our generation.
You can't even say that about Trump. What church is he attending now?
With Zelensky's personal calculus, I think one thing that is kind of important here is that, obviously, Trump is hugely vindictive and incredibly personally petty, on the scale that people aren't used to for a world leader. But Biden also is too. Biden is
he's frightening.
Bitter.
Yeah. At some point, he's between Gaza and Ukraine. His focus was entirely on we've killed a lot of people, and it was really frightening. He started to resemble Grandpa from Texas Chainsaw Massacre in a way. He wasn't very sentient anymore, but what he did
you can still bring that hammer down between someone's ears.
The motor function worked, and it's just vindictiveness and blood. That, and also, I mean, let's be honest, they were vindictive against Trump. I mean, they they kind of violated their unwritten rule that you don't arrest a president. They have their reasons, or charge him with a felony and convict him. And it's not that Trump isn't guilty of all kinds of crimes. I mean, they got him on kind of the lamest ones. But most presidents, in theory, were guilty of tons of crimes. But Biden is incredibly vindictive. I agree. But if you remember, I went back to this. The impeachment papers that were delivered to the Senate, it's called the Trump-Ukraine impeachment papers. Right? You think he doesn't remember that shit? Yes, to him, Ukraine, which then becomes like the cause célèbre for the whole liberal, globalist, whatever is in Marxist, establishment in their minds. Like, to him, Ukraine is the very opposite of that. Ukraine is the source of all of his problems.
But like a corollary to that is that Russia has become something of a cause of its own on the sort of international right, a sort of like a fashion turn, if you will. I mean, outside the hardcore Nazis fighting Russia in Ukraine, what do you make of the global right wing or the Western right wing's fascination with Russia? What do they see Russia as like a counterweight to what they regard as kind of like the global liberal order that also happens to be a country full of white people?
I think it helps if you don't know, if you can idealize Russia if you don't know Russians and you've never spent time there. I don't mean that they're bad. I just mean you can invent in your mind this, perfect white anti-globalist nation if you actually haven't been there and seen, hung out with them. And they're just people, right? But so I think I don't know where the hell it comes from, except that all the people that they hate Russia, so therefore Russia must be good. It kind of comes down to that, because Russia is, at least like the big cities. It's liberal. It's liberal in the kind of European sense, right? So it's not into it's not woke, but it's liberal. So it's not like it's I don't know, whatever their Turner Diaries fantasies are. It's nothing like that. And so I'm not sure where they get it from. It's just that Putin is hated by all the people that they hate.
And correspondingly, Ukraine is beloved because
exactly. Even though Ukraine it's kind of weird. It must be tough to be a Nazi, right? Because it's the biggest Nazi place is Ukraine, but Ukraine, and actually it's tough for Ukrainian Nazis. They there's a great Substack, Events in Ukraine, which just collates all of how Ukrainians themselves talk about Ukraine and all the Telegram channels and all this stuff. And a lot of this is also kind of translating bits from the Fourth Reich and Votan Yugen, all these different Ukrainian Telegram channels that are huge and cater to the neo-Nazi and Nazi adjacent crowd. And they're always complaining. They're like, God damn it, we have to suck it up with these EU liberals and all these Soros grant feeders here, because they're the ones that basically we need these awful globalist, liberal, Marxist, LGBTQ people to kill Russians, which is our first thing. But God, do we want to kill them too? We just have to go first. We have to kill the Russians. It's driving us crazy. It's a tough time to be a Nazi.
Well, this is something I want to get into. It's a tough time to be in Ukraine, period. It's a nightmare. And Mark, you touched on something earlier that I wanted to get to, which is the issue of morale among the Ukrainian public. Because whenever you see someone from the West saying hey, gee, it kind of seems like this war needs to come to an end, you get an angry chorus of people saying no, the West has nothing to do with this. Ukraine's its own country. They have their own agency. It's for them to decide how long they want to fight this war, not you. Which is I definitely agree with that in principle. But I know the government and a lot of the Western-backed NGO network in Ukraine, they want to keep this war going. They want to fight to the last man. But this is the same government that has also banned opposition political parties and elections for the last couple of years. Does the Ukrainian public, how does the people of Ukraine feel about continuing to fight this war? Because I bring this up because it's one of these things that when I come across it on a social media feed or I become aware of it through a news article, it just freezes my soul with like how frightening and nightmarish it is. But like just the phenomenon of like the press gangs that are just
Yeah.
like going
Mhm.
around on the streets, pulling people into vans off the street, and then they're down to like basically like the crippled and the alcoholics, and
Mhm.
sending them to these
Well,
like death
if you
camps that
haven't
just-
seen the video of the Hare Krishna membership being press ganged en masse for the Trump.
It's true. No, for
What?
serious.
Oh
No,
my
No,
god!
this really happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my god!
I mean, like, but like this phenomenon of like squeezing like the last dregs out of like the men who are left alive in this country to like send them straight to the front with like almost no training to just die. Basically, I mean, it's almost unspeakable to imagine how frightening and not just how terrible that is. Like, how do you think the people of Ukraine feel? Like, did they want this war to keep continuing? Like outside their government, I mean, like in certain. I mean, I'm sure it's like it's very divided, but like, what is the appetite to continue this war in among Ukrainians themselves?
My best guess is we can't know because Ukraine is under martial law and people get press ganged or go to prison or something, for speaking up against the war. So it's hard to know, and polls are conducted under those wartime circumstances where it's dangerous to give your opinion. But even polls now that sort of in the last few months that some official Ukrainians have come out and said, we do need to start talking about ceasefire talks or negotiations or peace. Suddenly the poll numbers shot up, which says to me that people were waiting for permission to say that, yes, we want peace and we're willing to give up territory for peace. But I think a much starker number are the number of desertions in the military. And I think officially the number was something, this was last year though, about 80,000, but unofficially, and by this I mean what Ukrainians and military analysts themselves have been able to judge up, the numbers are more like about 250,000 desertions. That is massive, massive. And that's why they have manpower problems. Like right now, the Ukrainians don't have huge munitions problems. They probably will over time if Trump cuts them off. They have almost parity, it seems like, with artillery. I just heard people who are near the front lines. They have our parity with drones, which are, increasingly a huge part of the war. The problem is their units are just full of holes and the reason there's so much mass desertion is because the commanders treat them like absolute shit. They rent seek off them. You have to pay money not to be put in the front lines where you die. And if you don't pay money, you're put in the front line. You're put in the front lines. And then all of these units, I mean, there are some better ones that don't do this, and the Nazi ones tend to be better, less corrupt in some ways.
That's a grim thought,
isn't it?
Yeah.
I know. What
Yeah.
the Nazis do is they shake down other
At least-
people, but they don't
Yeah.
shake their own people down as much,
Well,
as far as I know.
At least it's an ethos.
Exactly. So really, I think that is the fact that they can't that they know how explosive it would be to mobilize 18 to 25-year-olds, not just because there's a serious demographic problem there, and that's true, but because it could cause an explosion. It could cause a political explosion. That wouldn't happen if you had people lined up and if you had high morale. The problem is from the top, from the systemic structure of this government to the leadership, from Zelensky's office down to the generals, the command, the strategy. This guy Syrskyi, who he appointed as his commander in chief, who's a crap general, who's hated by everybody. He was called like the butcher of Ukraine. All these Russian generals are called like the butcher of Syria, the butcher of this, because they killed other people. Syrskyi's called the butcher of Ukraine because he kills his own people. He sends his own people to die.
Jesus.
So he's just absolutely awful, but he's a loyalist. And, you've had like units. This actually even came out in Ukrainska Pravda, which was funded by USAID. I don't know how much they're going to be doing, but like the problem of like, I don't know, exploitation within military units is so bad that they've been suppressing these stories, and the Western media still suppresses it, but Ukrainian not as much, where you had this one, large formation where the dad was at the top, pulling all the money. You force all your grunts to pay you money. You pay them whatever your salary is, pay you money. If you want to be further from the lines, you have to pay more money. And then his son was like the enforcer. And there were people who weren't paying up, and the son wanted to make an example of one of them, so he crucified him and took a photo of it. This was published in Ukrainska Pravda, of this grunt who wasn't paying up, to show it to the other grunts that, this is what's going to happen to you if you don't pay up. The number of stories about, soldiers left to die. Commanders won't risk having one of their APCs put in any danger. So they'd rather just let like 5 grunts die near the front. Like, I've read story after story of like that. So if you ask me, like, the war is unpopular because, the war is broadly unpopular because people do not trust or believe or have faith in their leaders, in the people running the show. It's not that they are welcoming the Russian expansion or Putin. They would rather just be left the hell alone.
I mean, and you add to that, like, another factor which I learned about through your show is that, like, this phenomenon of a certain class of people in Ukrainian society, those linked to the sort of Western-backed NGOs, have somehow managed to be exempt from being drafted into the military. I would imagine that inspires an unbelievable amount of hatred and anger among people who are, losing family members and loved ones by every day.
Absolutely. The class structure of this war, it's like an exaggerated version of a class structure of a lot of wars, but it really
the U.S. Civil War, the 20 slaves rule in the Confederacy. If you had 20 slaves, you could be exempt from military service, and if you had 20 slaves, you were very rich. I mean, it's automatic. So it's equivalent to saying the very rich don't have to serve in the ranks, and that infuriated Southern soldiers who were otherwise very, very willing to fight for the Confederacy. But the other thing I thought has been oddly muffled in the Western press is losses. I mean, how many have died? You could not get a reliable estimate on this until the New York Times published one toward the end of last year. And they say, and it's probably a conservative estimate given the Times biases, that 105,000 soldiers have been dead or mangled. That is, the word is irretrievably irreversibly lost.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are that many who are mangled and not serviceable anymore, there must be hundreds of thousands who are out of combat.
I mean, put it this way, in the Wall Street Journal in the summer of 2023, so this is a month into that disastrous counteroffensive, and this is one of the kind of contingent points in the war that really sank Ukraine. This, NATO-advised counteroffensive, just go right into those minefields. I was actually looking back at some of the New York Times articles, and they were quoting U.S. and U.K. officials who advised the whole strategy for the counteroffensive of walking through the minefields. They said the success of this depended on the Ukrainians willing to take very high casualties. It turned out they just weren't up to the task, or something like that.
Jesus,
there's that lack of gratitude that Trump was talking about.
Yes. So, but in the Wall Street Journal article, a month into the counteroffensive, and it was a 3-month just bloodbath, they reported that. So that would have been, a year and 3 months or 4 months into the war, there were 50,000 Ukrainian amputees. And that's over a year and a half ago. And the war's gotten a lot bloodier since then for Ukrainians. Think about, I mean, it's so bad, man. It's so depressing.
And like in the Western press, in the American press, like, in now in 2025, like you still see like op-eds and voices that are saying, U.S. credibility is on the line here, or it would be a mistake to abandon Ukraine. But at the same time, you can kind of tell that they're preparing their readers for a kind of an inevitable defeat. But like, I'm interested in this idea of U.S. credibility, because it seems like, I wonder what you guys make of the Trump administration and they're kind of open acknowledgement that the United States is not in the credibility business anymore. Like
That's a
it's
really
like it's
great
like
way of putting it, yeah.
we're like the power that we have is considerable, but we don't need to be the moral force that overrides the world, and like our behavior in our empire is justified by that moral force. Because frankly, and the experience of Gaza this past year with the Biden administration, it's not worth our time to pretend that we have credibility.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the Democratic establishment's response to that is like open mouthed. Wait, you can't do that, but they can.
Yeah. I mean, I think what the Trump people are saying is no one's going to invade us. So what is the purpose of all this? Like people, no one's going to invade the U.S. That's kind of their basic way of looking at it, I think. I mean, it's not like I wouldn't get our hopes up that, the Trump administration is going to somehow be the anti-imperialist administration, but they do seem less.
No, they just want to return to like an earlier form of imperialism rather than like kind of the post-World War II liberal hegemony.
Yes.
Yeah, Trump's favorite guy is McKinley.
Yeah.
I know. He keeps talking about him. I don't know who told him about McKinley.
I know.
But he loves him.
I know. It's very strange. I think, there's this amazing quote. I think it was Dean Acheson who said, well, this is, I don't know, maybe similar, prestige. Prestige is the shadow cast by power. And it's a really kind of weirdly fascinating quote for Americans usually don't have interesting quotes like that. I think John, I said it once on our show, and John, you said that was almost Maoist sounding.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool. But that assumes that every way you designate credibility is on the line is equal, and it's not equal. This was a stupid war to put credibility or prestige on the line for. It was rooted in a lot of really bad assumptions, stupid assumptions, and a lot of really like malevolent assumptions, which is, well, whatever happens, at least we'll kill a lot of Russians and bog them down. And will the war end up like if Trump ends it? Trump doesn't have his own, put it this way, Trump doesn't have his own prestige and credibility at stake. Ukraine's victory is not tied up with Trump's prestige, right? At all. The very opposite is true. So his credibility is not going to be hurt. Although I could easily see what's going to happen is like the centrist liberal establishment in this country, they're going to cry stabbed in the back theory at Trump if and when the Ukraine war is ended on bad terms for Ukraine. I don't know if that'll hurt him. I don't know if he cares, but I think they will.
I am sort of curious to see if they'll attempt to do like a sort of replay of what happened to Biden with Afghanistan. But there was something I wanted to ask both of you that I was kind of curious about, because I've seen a few people ask about this or speculate about this, but that this idea that the Biden team's plan, not really Biden specifically, because I don't think you could yank this concept out of him, but like more the Sullivan and possibly Blinken type people in the administration, that their idea was basically that like they were setting things up for Ukraine to just be like a 20-year long insurgency that would bleed Russia for like a generation.
Right. The javelins were perfect for that, right?
Yeah. That dream has been around DC for a long, long time. And it is an Acela corridor dream, a DC dream. And it meant that not just Biden, but the liberal establishment that people I knew had dinner with occasionally became frightening, really frightening. Like a friend of mine walked out on a dinner party after they started talking about how delicious it was that thousands of Russians were dying in this war. And I think there's some kind of upper middle class bubble in the U.S. that has never really moved on from the Cold War, even though a lot of these people weren't even children when it was going strong.
John, when I interviewed the filmmaker Alex Cox, he brought up the fact that he had read a profile of Jake Sullivan in which Jake Sullivan said the movie Red Dawn is his favorite movie of all time. And like,
God.
And then like he's punching his fist in the air, going Wolverines.
I mean, that's a great movie, but man, not if the
I love Red Dawn too, but I wouldn't base my geopolitical worldview around it.
I should not be the national security advisor because I like Red Dawn. Let's just make that absolutely clear.
Yeah,
you know?
Much less because I was deadly dweebly serious about that.
Yes.
But as your friend pointed out, Mark, like, well, that's Dolan because he's got this fucked life.
Yeah.
I'd like to become Secretary of Education because I like the movie Equilibrium.
But hey, getting back to your very first question, if you don't mind me bringing this, I'm curious what you guys think, because I always listen to your show and big fan of you guys. I'm curious what you think, how you think this war ends, what it looks like in the U.S.
How do you like the political fallout, or like on the institutional side for like the blob?
Well, maybe both, actually. Yeah.
That's a really good question.
It's a tough one. Yeah.
I've been really interested by like specifically like Sullivan, McGurk, Blinken, basically all these people who, you know how like Biden always talks about how he was friends with Scoop Jackson and that's how he learned to like love Israel and all this bullshit.
Yeah.
And that like a lot of his administration was this like pantomime of Scoop Jackson and like Dean Rusk and all these like Cold War liberals. With the actual like meat and bones of the administration, it at times seemed like, a kid putting on his dad's suit, but with like, like Dean Atchinson's suit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Model UN stuff.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
And like in the best of like, not even the best, in like a baseline average world, the result of this would be like a mass demoralization of this line of thinking where they're like, oh my God, everything was going our way. We fucked everything up. Everyone hates us. Everything we tried to do backfired. Literally everything. Is this the end of like, liberal interventionism, liberal institutionalism post Cold War? But in actuality, what we actually see every time someone suffers not just a loss, but a humiliating loss is they come back 10 times more delusional and insane.
Yeah.
So I think in like the next Democratic administration, which the current administration seems dead set on saving the life of the Democratic Party.
Yes.
No one is trying harder than the fucking Trump administration.
Yeah, because the Democrats aren't trying at all.
Yeah. They're tying off a vein, shooting fentanyl into it, gun to their head, a Rube Goldberg device, putting like a plastic bag over their head, knocking them into the Pacific Ocean, and like putting stones in their pocket. And the Republicans are doing everything in their power to replace the fentanyl with pure black tar. Just do anything. Save them.
It's amazing.
I think, in like 5 years, it's going to be like, we need to give a hydrogen bomb to fucking Estonia,
Yeah, it's a Kaya Kallas.
Just to add on to like what my impression of this is, just to like to add on to what Felix says, like I just like going back to something I said earlier, like I think they're going to be stung by it, but they're going to kind of pretend like they do with everything. They're just going to kind of pretend that it never happened. But at the same time, I think that they're actually kind of secretly relieved especially in the new kind of like Trump world order, like where I said, where like the U.S. can be an empire without overriding moral or democratic principles. Because I think as for liberals, especially, the cost of that is just too high for them. And I'm speaking specifically about the war in Gaza. Like when Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, that was when like Hillary Clinton was making public statements like, if Vladimir Putin doesn't want to be called a war criminal, he should not bomb hospitals and schools. And then like, and then we realized, they're real. Sometimes you have to bomb hospitals and schools. Sometimes you have to just indiscriminately kill civilians if it's, to our benefit. And I think the right, it's easier for the right because they've never claimed to be on the side of morality, democracy, or virtue of any kind. So I think for the liberal establishment, I think for the liberal, and they're right because like the liberal establishment, like it is a scam to them. Like, and it's the scam is ceasing to work for them. And I think that they're privately are kind of relieved that they have to stop justifying American power in the terms of like democracy and human rights.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah, and so they're going to be able to like scale it down a lot, but they're still going to try and find a way. I mean, it means a lot to that class to be the moral leader. It means a lot, in that Acela corridor class. It means a lot to them to be able to believe that somehow they are better, different and better. And it doesn't mean that, of course, the Trump faction has just pure contempt for that. They think it's a scam and they think it's aimed at them. And they're right, in a lot of ways, they're right. It is aimed at them too. So, they'll find a way when they get back in power, because Trump and the Republicans will screw up so much, they'll force the Democrats against their will to retake power. And when they do retake power, they'll find a way to be like, we're great again. Our long nightmare is over, and the same bullshit.
I think also it'll be part of their kind of like their continued their growing distrust and hatred of like the voting public in America for letting them down. Because
that's been their main answer that I've seen in
and like because they're going to be confronted with the reality that when this war does come to an end, like Americans mostly won't care one way or the other because it doesn't really affect them.
No,
I think like that they're not, like the average American, be they Republican or Democrat, does not think that like Ukraine is the most important thing to fight for in the world today.
No, in fact,
nor do they want to see their tax dollars going to fund it.
One of the ironies about this is that there's kind of a demarcation in the liberal or mainstream American mind about what people matter, and it was very clear that Palestinians didn't matter, but you could have figured that out from sampling American opinion anytime during the past few decades. So it wasn't really a surprise. But I don't think Slavic lives matter much to those people either, or ever have. And that includes Ukrainian lives. Like, it made it very easy to say, well, that's a sacrifice we're willing to make.
Yes.
John, do you remember when during like the sort of first 3 months of the war, when like everything media-wise, marketing-wise was sort of, it was working in sync for the Sullivan, Biden type people, and the ad campaign they came out with where it's like, this is what it would look like if the fucking Eiffel Tower got bombed. And that was always so insane to me, because the subtext is like, well, you might not care now, but like, what if this happened to real Europeans?
What if they hit human
that
beings?
Ad to Americans, how would you feel if the Eiffel Tower got bombed? To an American audience, they'd be like, sick. That's awesome. That'd be great.
Going back a little to what Will said, I think you're right in that, like, not just this, but like after Gaza, that it's going to have to be more naked.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think, like, I don't know, this administration has been incredibly instructive for me, because the depth of cultural memory in America and just the Western world in general has been so fucking ravaged by our mode of media consumption that anything that happened 6 months ago, it might as well have happened in the 11th century.
Yes, totally.
But the Trump campaign this go around was so interesting to me, because it was a billion different things going in a billion different directions. But there was a lot of this national conservatism shit, where it's like, Josh Hawley and like, we actually like the CFPB.
Yes.
We're going to go after payday.
We like Lena Khan. We would keep her.
Yeah, and it was this like pantomime of like a mid-century conservatism that's never really existed in America, but like, like all forms of American reaction, just a past that never really existed and a future that you can't attain melded together. And in practice, we get super austerity, the dumbest program of austerity I've ever seen in America. Like, worse austerity than like maybe Hoover, and done at a more reckless pace. And like, the head of the CFPB is this like Christian soy jack guy who follows OnlyFans models on his official account.
Wow.
And he's hawking a payday lender from his official government account. And it's just so naked, but also so far in the other
That's the
direction.
Project 2025 guy, Russell Vaughn.
Yes.
Yeah, he was like previously the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was strangling working class Americans by preventing them from getting these great loans on offer.
That's right. Yes, I saw that. That's insane.
And like, and this is a company that got dinged by the Financial Protection Bureau because it was just like, It was just defrauding people. It was just straight up
Well,
like,
one thing I would have to say, having lived in Kentucky a bit, and I don't know how many people, but like a lot of people from the base that's drawn from are used to getting scammed and ripped off by people. Like I don't know, it's a different type of getting ripped off. It's that kind of low rent rip off. And scamming that is a lot more endemic to that culture. And, New York, California, liberals rip you off in other ways and scam you in other ways. But that kind of low rent scam is like, oh, well, he must be one of us. So,
But I think everyone is going to be like that. We've talked a lot about how like there are these swings and micro swings in American culture now, how we're currently like in an anti-woke moment that is rapid, like quicker than the woke stuff.
It's
as
weird.
Predicted is wearing out its welcome.
Yeah.
Part of the micro swings will be that like each major party will like the swing will be part of like the campaign. As in you will campaign on like national conservatism to the base, I guess, and then like Project 2025 to the evangelical institutional class, and then as a moderate to like Pennsylvania voters. When you're actually in power, it's like Silicon Valley is super austerity with no plan. For Democrats, it's going to be we're going to restore honor and dignity. And I have a lot of normal Democrats in my life. The line I keep hearing is, we're going to rebuild. We have before.
Wow.
And, the rank and file believe that in some cases. And the line from whoever the next Democratic president will be, it will be echoes of this like Cold War liberal institutionalism. But in practice, it will be more naked than ever, similar to what happened with the Trump people. And that will make these cultural and political swings much quicker and much more violent, but also will, I think, diminish participation in them ultimately.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one thing, that's one thing, a couple of things that, what you're talking about brought up. One is that, here, when the Ukraine war is wound down, this greatest crusade since 1945, moral crusade for democracy and all this stuff, it'll just be a puff of smoke, except to people, a small group of people to whom it did mean everything and they look bad, but they'll move on to something else. But in Europe, and so that can go away without a lot of damage. But in Europe, I think it's going to be different. I think the Europeans have been very suicidal. I mean, they have the war's been actually pretty good for the U.S. economy, for fossil fuels and for the arms industry and for things that we make. Actually, it's probably been more of a boon for Europe, especially Germany, when they lost that 30-year-long contract at a fixed price, a fixed amount of cheap Russian gas, and had to go out in the market every day and buy their gas. It's just like their industry was already suffering from some problems, and it was like the push that kicked them over the ledge, and they've been really suffering. They just committed suicide so that Biden could brag the time that he killed a lot of Russians. It's absolutely bizarre. And when this war ends and they realize they've convinced themselves, or had the Estonians and the Poles convince them, if we don't stop them in like Velika Novosilka, which it took them 2 years to take, then the next day they're going to march into Berlin and Paris. And when they realize that that's not going to happen, that didn't happen, that I think could be very destabilizing for the establishment political class.
Well, what do you make of these calls that I've been seeing in Europe to like have the EU like form their own united military to like, because I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that like when a push comes to shove, they're like, are you sending peacekeepers to Ukraine? They're like, nope. Mm-hmm. But you're right. They're still, they think the Russian bear is going to overtake them. What do you make of these calls to like have a unified EU military as a counterbalance to Russia?
Yeah, John, I mean, you don't just then say, okay, what are they going to have, like those Ukrainian vans going around throwing French kids in cars?
First of all, do they think that? Do they think that?
Exactly.
And I don't think they do. I think they're just flat out lying. They're making up this threat. If Russia can't take Kyiv, it can't take Berlin. I mean, that's pretty clear. So I think this has been a chance for the European governing class almost to detach itself purposely from the people. And it's expressed a kind of hate for the people. much like the United States governing class has in the past couple of years. They wanted to be distinguished from this in that they still feel the enthusiasm for, I don't know what you'd call it, like conference politics
Yeah.
that everybody
they
else
love their
got really
conferences.
sick of long ago.
Yeah, I just think they're going to look at the costs and the time. You can't just put together an EU army that is in any way a threat, like that could do anything but, like, I don't know, maybe move goods to the Ukrainians. You know, maybe that's what they plan to do, but they're still vulnerable. But you can't just create an army and have them up and running in a couple months. Like John said, you know, recently, it's not like the 18th century militias or something. Like, you have to create institutions, and it takes a long time.
Yeah, just coming up with shell production for the basic artillery shells that are the main weapon of the war in the trenches. They've had to revive factories in Copenhagen that produced shells long ago, like 50 years ago. And they're back in business, but you know, it's going to last for a few years, maybe, and then what becomes of those factories? It's not really clear that it's going to do anybody any good.
They tried to get the entire EU, or at least the EU above a certain income level, like the main players, on the same multi-role, like 4.5th generation fighter jet, the Eurofighter Typhoon.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost worked, but then of course there was a falling out with France, and they made their own plane out of spite. Yeah. But they're gonna unify. They're gonna make a unitary military. Like, okay,
yeah. No, I mean, if they look, I do think this Russia's invasion did stir up some deep European fears and other feelings, not very pleasant, you know, old European feelings that were supposed to have been put away after 1945 in a lot of places. But I think, I think I don't think they're like kind of inventing this fear. I think, at least with the governing classes, the fear, like they've whipped each other up into a frenzy, and they also, you know, police each other and make sure they're all whipped up into a frenzy at all times. Otherwise, like you're maybe have the Russian disease. But they don't really believe it, because if they really believed it, if anybody really believed that today, Bakhmut, tomorrow, Berlin, we would have gotten involved directly in the war. And the war has been going badly for Ukraine since January, February 2023. So 2 years now, very badly. And if you really thought, you would have done like what the Allies did after Poland was invaded. You would say, okay, I'm putting actual skin in the game. And we keep saying over and over, we will not put like physical skin in this game. We'll help the Ukrainians put all their skin in the game, but we're not going to do it. And that's because I think, ultimately they know, but certainly their populations know, that Europe is not threatened. Russia's not going to invade them. And I think that is going to cause a real, because the Europeans have actually sacrificed, particularly Western Europeans have sacrificed their beloved, high standards of living to a certain degree. I think it's going to really cause another level of problems for the kind of establishment political parties and media and that whole class. Like I would think it'd be problematic for them.
One of the last things I wanted to ask you about is like the last group of people that I think are going to be negatively affected by the end of this war is the rise of this class of like what they refer to themselves as SIG-int analysts or open SIG-int analysts. Really, a collection of wannabe war nerds who have become all experts on armed conflict, and of course are all extremely pro-NATO and anti-Russia. I mean, and they were really feeling themselves for like the last couple of years, but one by one they've sort of clammed up and moved on because they're not actually fighting this war; they're just posting. But like, what do you make of the phenomenon of these kind of like the classic war nerd type, the armchair signals analyst, and their role in this conflict?
The open source intelligence bros.
Open SIG-int.
Yeah, a lot of their funding, weirdly, a lot of them went quiet when the USAID money got pulled. But that whole phenomenon kind of goes back to Bellingcat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they're the ones that popularized that. And then of course it turned out Bellingcat gets all this money from the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Endowment for, the Contras or whatever they really are, um, and uh, um, and they're just such an awful group. And one of the things again that really kind of showed who these people really were was as soon as the war, Israel's war in Gaza started, they all of them cited. It's like those accounts like Nexta and so those different like Polish right wing run accounts. They all sided with the
Visegrad.
Israelis. Visegrad 20, yeah, Visegrad
Yeah,
20,
yeah.
exactly.
My favorite account.
Yeah, great account. Um, yeah, they all were just the terrorists, kill the terrorists, and covering up for Israel's crimes and calling like protesters in the West against the genocide, calling them Hamas terrorists. All these OSINT accounts were just like violently anti-Palestine and pro-Israel. So they lost because no matter what, that war did make a lot of liberals queasy in one way or another. So that kind of hurt their credibility. But yeah, their value, I think, more than anything, was in the first year of the war, year and a half, in both massively amplifying and exaggerating how poorly things were going for Russia and how great it was going for Ukraine, and then more importantly, perhaps like NAFO, in suppressing anybody who went out of line, who was not completely.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. That it was a lot like a church congregation, and now it's like a church congregation whose second coming didn't quite happen. But for a long time there, they were policing the congregation for signs of doubt, and you could pay pretty heavily in online terms if you expressed any of that doubt. But the interesting thing to me is, and Mark and I were talking about this before, there's no original, as far as I know, Western free inquiry about some of the facts of the war that are being fiercely downplayed by an elephant's foot. Like, what are Ukrainian casualties?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
there
amazing.
There are sources in the Russian sphere that try to cover that, but I haven't heard any brave Western inquiries about that.
Yeah, all these OSINT accounts, and somehow they can't come up with casualty figures because that whole what it is propaganda. Obviously, it's propaganda to give people the immediate impression that actually neutral citizen journalists and citizen open source intelligence followers, and that they're giving us unbiased views, but nobody is trying to give us numbers on casualties. And I saw even Tom Massey, that sort of Ron Paulish Republican guy. He's the only person in Congress who's actually openly complained about it. He said even in their intelligence meetings, they're given he said, we're given just propaganda on casualties. Like the Congress Intelligence Committee, they will not give us casualty figures. And he complained openly about this over and over. So they're keeping it not just from us. And this is our media. I mean, we have so much media resources geared towards that war, towards finding out how bad things are going for Russia, how the ruble is going to turn into rubble and all their problems there, and how many have died. I mean, we want to say it's close like to 500,000 or something. And at least we want people to believe that. I don't believe that, but it has been bad. But they will not tell us the casualty figures. And this is a huge, like in 3 years, this is supposed to be a war about freedom versus authoritarianism, freedom of press versus censorship, democracy versus dictatorship, and our own press. And the Ukrainians will talk about it some, but we're the ones who, like, our press is deliberately keeping from us by deliberately not inquiring into this. What are the casualty figures? And, we can guess why, because it's going to be a bummer. It's going to be a bummer for all of us. And it's going to make it clear that the war has gone badly, and it's going to disgust people too. And the job, I think, of the media and the OSINT bros and all this has been to keep up morale in the home front where all the money and armaments come from, and keep that flowing to the Ukrainians. Because the Ukrainians, you can just press gang. You can just grab them off the street and throw them, in a van, beat them up and throw them in the front. But you can't do with the Westerners. What you have to do is lie to us.
Mark Ames and John Dolan, I think we should leave it there for today. But I want to thank you both for joining us again on the program. And I would encourage all our listeners to check out Radio War Nerd if you haven't done so already. Available on Patreon. We'll have a link in the show description. Once again, Mark and John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
Always a pleasure.
Great.
Really appreciate it.
I just have a bit of something to announce at the end of the show today. If you're in New York City on March 2nd, Sunday, March 2nd, this coming up, I will be part of a fundraising party for Zoran for mayor at the Club 101 on Avenue A. Hesse and I will be doing a live Oscars watch party on Sunday night. So we'll have a link to tickets for that if you'd like to come out and have some fun and donate money to Z for Zoran, Z for NYC.
Dang.
All right. Till next time, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.